Hello, we are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and we found this old radio broadcast podcast in the public access, public domain, freely available, so there shouldn't be any copyright problems there, or strikes or claims. And basically it verifies that the Aramaic was originally used in the New Testament. This would be the Galilean Aramaic we're referring to, not the modern Galilean Aramaic or the derivative Syriac. So enjoy, and if you like it, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, add your comments below the video. We'll get back to you on those as soon as we can, and then go share this with all family, friends and others that you know.
The reason that we see the Aramaic there is because at those moments, Mark and other evangelists, when they use Aramaic, would shift from writing in Greek to writing in Aramaic, because these conversations, at least the vast bulk of them, presumably originally occurred in Aramaic, and occasionally specific sayings that Jesus made in Aramaic were then remembered and preserved. So like Talitha Koum, well, Peter was right there for that event, and Mark's gospel is based on the preaching of Peter. So presumably when Peter was speaking, when he was preaching about this event, he would say, and then Jesus said to her, Talitha Koum. And he may or may not have translated that, but Mark, one way or another, knew what it meant, because Mark was an Aramaic speaker, being a native of Jerusalem. And so then, when Mark came to write down his gospel, he's repeating the essence of what Peter said, including the Aramaic phrase, and then he also adds a translation in Greek so that the Greek-speaking readers would know. And then when modern translators come along, because they've got both an Aramaic phrase there and a Greek phrase, they'll translate the Greek but leave the Aramaic alone so that it preserves the experience that an original Greek-speaking reader would have had of encountering these Aramaic words. Okay, Craig?
Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you very, very much. 888-31-TRUTH, our number. It's open forum. If you have a question of a religious, philosophical nature, we are open to all comers today. 888-318-7884. Ryan in Texas, listening on Guadalupe Radio. You are up next. Your question for Jimmy Aiken.
All right, Jimmy, my question for you is, how would it have been possible for certain communities of Eastern Catholics to be present in the early days of Christianity? Like, for example, the Coptic Church, who traces their origins to Mark the Evangelist, or the Chaldean Church, who traces their origins to Thomas the Apostle, even though they're a split off of the Assyrian Church to the east. I ask this because I'm just curious how it would have been possible for them to be present, and if their usage of the Divine Liturgy and the Coptic and Aramaic languages would have sounded the same back then as one would expect to hear and see if they were attending either one of these churches.
Okay, so originally everybody was Catholic, and there wasn't a distinction in terms of church.
This really means this belief system was universal. There were those of the Roman Empirical Catholic Church or State Church, but there was also those Jews who refuted it, who refused to have any association with pagans like the disciples, etc., who were, like Peter, were kosher. That's what it really means. But this guy, it sounds like he's trying to say everyone was a Roman Catholic, which is incorrect. Everyone within the Roman Catholic Church, or the Roman State Church, was, i.e., a Roman Catholic part of the Empirical State Church.
Communion between Catholics and Copts, or Catholics and Chaldeans, or Catholics and Assyrians. We were all Catholics. And over time, so at the time, if you talked about someone who was a Copt, that would mean they were both Catholic and Coptic. They happen to be from Egypt. That's where we get the word Coptic. It just means from Egypt. Just like you would have Catholics from Rome and Catholics from Greece and Catholics from Palestine. So these were, at the time, national or ethnic terms rather than religious terms. Just like, I'm an American and I'm a Catholic, so I'm an American Catholic. American is my nationality, not my religion. And at the same time, Coptic at that point, or Chaldean, would have been ethnic national terms rather than indicating a religious identity. But over the course of time, there were divisions where people in particular areas, either conceived of nationally or as ethnic groups, experienced a division of one kind or another with the Catholic Church, and in some cases that division has been repaired. That's the case with the Chaldean Church, for example. They, a few centuries ago, a certain group of Christians from that part of the world, modern Iraq, came back into communion with the Catholic Church, and so full communion between our churches has been restored, and they're Catholic now, but they retain the modifier Chaldean as.
So what they did, this is what really happened, was the American missionaries went to Iraq. They went to Urmia. It's the King James Version Bible, right? And they tried to convert the Syrians, who were Surai, Sourai, to their form of Christianity, their Western Christianity. There was no grammar, so these people had to create it, apparently. So it was very difficult for them to translate the King James Version, the Shakespeare speak, into the Syriac, their particular language of Umia in Iraq or Iraq. So they eventually did, and they convinced these Surai, or these Mesopotamians, Chaldeans, or whoever, to convert. So some of them became Christians. They dropped their Surai name, and they became Christians. But the problem with that King James Version that they translated, they botched it. Supposedly, the Western Peshitta is a mixture of, or an attempt of these particular people trying to translate the King James Version into the Syriac. So this Victor N. Alexander, who pointed that out, was given the copy of the original ancient, very old Tav Asheret Lishana Atika Sapraya, sacred scribal tongue of God that he used to speak to Adam and Eve, or that he spoke to Adam and Eve in the garden, and that the men at the Tower of Babel spoke by this high priest of that original ancient church of the East. Well, it's a modern version of it, but it's basically a revival of it, right? He's given this Bible format, so he found a way to translate it, because it's a long D language, the Tav Asheret, by using the root words of the modern vernacular, i.e. possibly the Syriac or the Galilean Aramaic, etc., and the cuneiform texts of Mesopotamia, which were like 3,000 years older. He translated all of those by using the system of using the root words of the modern vernacular to revive that long dead language, so that he could translate these original ancient, very old manuscripts into the nearest English equivalent without the usual translator prejudice, bias, adding their own flavour, opinion, view, and twisting it, right? As many others had that he had found. So he brought to us the nearest translation of those very old yet dead languages or manuscripts, languages of that manuscript, into the nearest English equivalent. And that's what we, the Ministry of the Real Truth, look at and bring to you via our channel, YouTube channel, the Ministry of the Real Truth.
way of indicating where they're from and what liturgical traditions and legal traditions they follow.
He's right. Where this group of Assyrians, Chaldeans, or whatever, they hit up with the. They joined up or merged with the Roman Catholic Church, but at some point they split over a disagreement that possibly about Mary. Mary's just the woman chosen to give birth to the Christ is God incarnate in the flesh. They had some problems there, so they split. But yeah, some still stayed with the Roman Catholic Church. And apparently the Syrian Church of the East actually makes a statement that they have no association with them. There was a secretary at one time who tried to do a collaboration between the two, and supposedly she was told off about it. But who can verify that? But the Syrians, whether it's true or not.
In terms of would their liturgies have sounded the same? Well, broadly speaking, yes. It wouldn't be word for word identical. Language changes over time, and it changes in a couple of ways. One of the ways is
languages evolve. A lot of languages die out; they're not spoken anymore, so they have to create a modern vernacular or a modern version of that old language. Right? There's a method they have to use. We guess that to do that, right? So if these original ancient, very old manuscripts were hidden and preserved by that original Church of the Apostolic Church of the East, founded by Thomas, etc., then as the once patriarch in 1957, Patriarchate Mar Isai Shimon testifies in Andrew Gabriel Roth's one of his PDFs. He used to have it on his website, the Aramaic Scriptures.com, but for some reason he took it down, that the original manuscripts given to that church, to the high priest, by the very hands of the blessed disciple, either Adai or Thomas, remained intact. They were never tampered with, never translated, altered into another language, or that sort of stuff, right? So they remained intact, hidden and preserved for over 2,000 years from Emperor Constantine, who wanted to get hold of them, destroy them, and destroy those people of that church that had that, because it was a threat, right? Because they wanted to be the mother church, and these sayings of Christ, apparently they were threatening to that, right? They would reveal or expose them as pagan, fake, etc. However you find it, right? Put.
Words change their meaning and texts get revised. So I know that the Chaldean liturgy has been revised a number of times down through the years. In fact, there was a recent revision of the Chaldean liturgy that was led by Mar Jamo here, in the former bishop of El Cajon.
Oh yeah.
And he was very involved in a revision of their liturgy that occurred recently. The other way the language changes is pronunciation changes, and so even if you're using a similar text, it's not going to sound exactly the same, especially after a distance of 2,000 years. You can actually see this quite clearly in the case of the liturgy that's used in Aramaic by Chaldeans and also by Maronites, because they're speaking different dialects of Aramaic. And so if you're in a Chaldean setting, you'll hear a word pronounced with like Allah, with an on the end of it. But if you're in a Maronite setting, the accent is different, and you're going to hear it pronounced something like Allaho or Allahu, because the way they use vowels on the ends of words has changed. So that's just an illustration of how it changes over time. In terms of Coptic liturgy, it's undoubtedly not identical to what you would have heard 2,000 years ago, but it is going to be similar. And in fact, Egyptologists will point out modern Coptic as the best living approximation we have of what ancient Egyptian would have sounded like, because it's based on the ancient Egyptian language.
But now, Ryan, how does all that sit with you?
It's great. Can I ask one other thing, real quick?
Real quick,
Real
Ryan.
quick.
Sure. When Latin was introduced as the liturgy language of the Western Church in the 2nd century, would the usage of Latin itself and the Latin Rite Mass still have sounded the same when it was then, or the
No,
Mass,
they're
the catechisms, or the format?
they're different. Like I said, language changes over time, and that includes the pronunciation and the text. So the Latin liturgy has been revised in both large and small ways down through the centuries, and there's not just one version of the Latin liturgy. There are all kinds of different versions that have been used historically, including the Ambrosian Rite and the Sarum Rite, and various other local rites. It wasn't even standardized until the time of Pius V. And the pronunciation is going to be different. In fact, there's more than one way of pronouncing Latin today. There's ecclesiastical pronunciation, which, according to many scholars, is heavily influenced by the development of Italian accents. And then there's the classical pronunciation, which is a reconstruction that was proposed for classical Latin by scholars in the 19th century. So instead of saying vidi vidi vici, it would be wiki witty wiki and stuff like that. And instead of Cicero, it would be Cicero. And so even today, we have more than one way. There's like at least 3 popular ways of pronouncing Latin today. And in the ancient past, there would have been as many and more than that. It was good because it was an empire-wide language, and so it's not going to be pronounced the same way everywhere in the empire. Just like American English is not pronounced the same way everywhere in America. You know what I mean?
Okay, Ryan, we'll leave it there. I spoke with the bishop one time who he speaks Latin and celebrates liturgy in Latin and all that, and I asked him, I said, if you went back to Cicero's time, now I would say Cicero, but now that I've learned that, I said, do you think you could converse in Latin? And he said he thought that he could read it fine.
Yeah.
He didn't think that he would be able to converse with Cicero.
You'd probably pick it up.
Yeah,
but it would take
you'd
some
have to work at it,
Yeah.
because just it wouldn't sound the same over all those years. What I like too in Latin is that when you'll have to help me with this because you may know some of these, but like say obviously the word television doesn't exist in Cicero's Latin. So what do?
In modern Latin, there's actually a society that comes up with new words for things that we have today, like television and helicopter and computer. The Holy See published a list of such terms a number of years ago, and it had a word for cowboy in it, and so I did a blog post at jimmyaiken.com with the Latin title meaning "Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys."
I got to look that up. jimmyaiken.com. All right, Jimmy Aiken is our guest this hour. It is open forum, and turns out it's been quite a linguistic open forum thus far, but if you have a question of any aspect of the Catholic faith, you're welcome to call. Whether you're Catholic or not, you're very welcome. 888-318-7884. If you prefer the spelled version, 888-31-TRUTH. Right back with more open forum.
You're listening to a Spotlight Minute on Catholic Radio Network.
One of the dumbest decisions in all of history is found in the Bible. Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. The firstborn, Esau, is the one who had the majority of his father's inheritance coming to him, as well as the honor and title of being the firstborn, which was a very big deal in Old Testament days. In Genesis 25, when Esau got back from a hunting trip, he was so hungry that he traded his inheritance to his younger brother Jacob for a bowl of lentil soup. Crazy, huh? Can you imagine trading so much for something so small? Well, think of all the vices in your own life, and all that you traded in for your sin. Think of all the times you've chosen comfort instead of heroism. passing pleasure instead of eternal joy, and sin instead of sainthood. When you consider your sins in light of the big picture, wow, we must look pretty crazy to the angels and saints sometimes. This is Chris Stefanik from RealLifeCatholic.com.
We often talk about the worst case scenario. We say, well, it could be worse. What is the worst case scenario? There are a lot of scary ones in the news today, from ongoing conflicts in the Middle East to violence in urban centers near your city, the persecution of Christians everywhere. You've got tensions rising with North Korea. You've got the threat of nuclear weapons. But for Christians, the worst case scenario is to die in mortal sin, to leave this life outside God's friendship, because we want reality on our terms. And God gives us what we really want forever. If Jesus is not the Lord of everything, He's the Lord of nothing. So let's ask Him to keep us far from the lukewarmness that leads us to take our faith for granted. G.K. Chesterton once said that the best way to love something is to know it can be lost. I'm Patrick Coffin at patrickcoffin.me. Be a saint. What else is there?
Brought to you by the Catholic Radio Network.
I'm Tom Price.
And I'm Gloria Purvis. Tomorrow, Father Jordan Schmidt.
And Father Thomas Morrow talks about his new book, Amazing Saints. Join us for Morning Glory, 7 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Now back to Catholic Answers Live.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. It's July, and that means summer sale over at shop.catholic.com. Just about everything in our online shop is discounted. I don't know, 10, 15, 25%, some stuff, and even more in some cases. You don't need a promo code, just shop. Everything there on sale. Shop.catholic.com. Check out the bargains on hundreds of great Catholic resources, and it really is a lot of stuff at shop.catholic.com. It's open forum. Jimmy Aiken is our guest. Our number, 888-31-TRUTH. And we go now to George in Alabama, listening on the EWTN app. You are on. George, your question for Jimmy.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, I'm on Bluetooth. Just want to make sure. So my question is, how can one reconcile evolutionary theory with the doctrine that suffering and death didn't enter the world until sin did? And maybe I'm confused on if that, that doctrine, what it actually means. But, just...
There are various ways of doing this. Perhaps the most common is to say that the suffering and death that entered the world due to original sin is human, and it affects humanity. And so if our first parents hadn't sinned, then we wouldn't experience death. But that says nothing about whether other creatures would have experienced death apart from original sin. So, and this is a view, if I'm not mistaken, that Thomas Aquinas talks about. He talks about how, the nature of animals didn't change as a result of the fall, so that lions were still obligate carnivores before the fall, and they would have needed to eat prey. But consequently, the death that entered the world was human death. And so that's one way of dealing with it. There are others. A proposal that was made by the Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar was that God, in looking at history, foresaw humanity's fall and therefore allowed all of creation to be characterized by suffering and death in view of the fact that the fall would occur. And so on his view, or on his proposal anyway, I don't know that he proposed this as anything more than an idea to think about, but based on this proposal anyway, all of the record of death and suffering that we see in creation wouldn't have occurred if man had not fallen, but since God foreknew that man would fall, he allowed history to unfold in the way it did.
And we'll have to leave it there. George, lots and lots of calls today. Thank you so much for that call. Hope it was helpful, Jimmy's answer. We go now to Scott in Houston, listening on 1430 AM. Scott, your question for Jimmy.
Hey, thank you very much for taking my call. I appreciate it. I've been listening to y'all for a long time, and Jimmy, I just want to say you're probably the primary reason that I'm in the process of converting to the Catholic faith right now.
Wow. Well, congratulations, and thank you so much. You're very kind.
Well, thank you for that. Here's my question, though. I'm a husband and a father. I have 3 kids and my wife, obviously, and we're in the process of going through RCIA and faith formation and things of that nature. My parents and siblings are extremely devout Protestants, non-denominational by nature, but very, very Protestant. That's the way I was raised. And this decision to convert to Catholicism has really created some fractures in my family.
Yeah.
And I love them to death. They're fantastic people, good people, and I'm not. They're viewing this as a rejection of them and the faith that I was raised with, and they're viewing it as a personal affront. And it's not that at all. It's just this is something I feel compelled to do, largely about the study that I've undertaken and the fact that I've never experienced God the way that I have in Holy Mass, and I want to be all in on that. And so, that understands for any advice you would have is a way to bridge the familial divide here in a way that's loving and compassionate, but still maintains fidelity to what I believe to be the truth.
It's a difficult situation, obviously, and there's no single right answer here. It involves a judgment call, and frankly, it involves an ongoing application of prudential judgment, because as the situation changes, there will be different things that would be optimal to do at different moments. One of the things, and you may have you seem like a really, intelligent, sensitive guy, so you may have already been doing some of these things, but things that occur to me to do in a situation like this, if they're taking it as a personal affront or a rejection, I would say, I would bend over backwards to stress that that's not the case, that I appreciate the formation in the Christian faith that you gave me. I don't view this as a rejection of that. I view this as a building on that and even going deeper with the Christian faith by learning more about its historic expression and understanding. And to me, this represents not a rejection of what you gave me, but as a furthering and a completion of what you gave me. And so I'm very grateful for the religious upbringing that you gave me. I'm very respectful of your faith, and I recognize it's genuine, authentic Christian faith, and I still view y'all as my brothers and sisters and parents in Christ. And so this doesn't diminish anything in that regard. At the same time, I'm sure that you would agree that if you had an insight on a particular theological matter that, you hadn't really examined before, but you then saw evidence, say in the Bible, that convinced you this was true, even though it wasn't something that, you'd grown up with, that you would feel in conscience you needed to accept this position, even though it's something that, was over and above what you were raised with, and you would hope that other people would respect your conscience in this matter, that you need to obey your conscience. And I would want to do that for you, and that's all I'm asking that you do in this situation, because I believe I've found evidence that shows this to be the case, and I need to follow my conscience, and I still love you, still pray for you. I ask you to pray for me, and regardless of our differences that we have at the moment, let's keep lines of communication going. We can still love each other. We can still rejoice in our mutual Christian faith, even if it's being expressed in somewhat different ways. And one day, all of us are going, if we make it to heaven, we're all going to have way more mysteries revealed to us than are separating us right now, and God will ensure that we all end up understanding His mystery the way we should in the fullness of time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, sir.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, very much. 888-31-TRUTH is our number here. If you've got a question for Jimmy about the Catholic faith, any aspect of the Catholic faith, what we believe, why we believe those things, that is very welcome, whether you're Catholic or not. 888-318-7884. Tyler in San Bernardino, right here in California, watching on YouTube. Thanks for watching on YouTube, Tyler. Your question for Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy. I was just wondering if you knew if the Catholic Church has a view on the Book of Enoch and the separate Bible.
Okay, so I'm not sure what you're referring to as the Sefer Bible. Is that a particular Bible translation?
So it is a particular translation. Another word they use for it is the Aleph Tav, and it's a collection of 81 books, including the Book of Enoch.
Okay. The Catholic Church generally doesn't take positions on particular Bible translations, so it's not going to have one on that. If I knew more about it, I could offer you a more informed opinion, but frankly, I'm not familiar with it. The word Sefer it indicates like a document or a writing, so it sounds like some translation that somebody has just come up with. In terms of the Book of Enoch, there are a number of different books of Enoch. The most famous one is often called First Enoch, and the only Christian church that holds it to be canonical is the Tawahedo Orthodox Church in Ethiopia. Other Christians don't have it as part of their biblical canon, and that includes the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church doesn't hold that it's canonical. It can be a valid resource for scholars to study to understand the ideas that were present in Second Temple Judaism, which is when it was written, but the Catholic Church doesn't hold it to be part of the Bible.
Tyler, thanks very much. We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Call and ask Jimmy your question today on Catholic Answers Live.
Let's be honest. A visit to Catholic.com is like a visit to no other place on the internet.
An online provider of courses for your Catholic homeschool, is a sponsor of Catholic Answers Live. Homeschool Connections website is homeschoolconnections.com.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
Isn't it awesome that we today do not recognize His presence in the Eucharist? Is it because we really don't go to Him in humbleness of heart and say, Lord, I don't believe, help my unbelief. Lord, I want to see You. I want to recognize You. I cannot live without You. Are we saying that?
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic. Call now with your question. 888-318-7884. This is Catholic Answers Live.
Open Forum with Jimmy Akin today on Catholic Answers Live, both hours. So if you're on the line and you're thinking, I don't know if it'll get to me by the top of the hour, don't worry. We'll be here again, Jimmy and I, for the second hour. And we will do our very best to get to all the calls. And if you're not a Catholic, let me stress again, you're very welcome to call. Everyone's welcome on Open Forum Day. Got a question about the Catholic faith? 888-318-7884. Julian in Cincinnati is next. Julian is at 7:40 a.m. or listening at 7:40 a.m. there in Cincinnati. Julian, your question for Jimmy.
Hey guys, thanks for taking my call. So I called about a month ago to ask sort of like the same question, but then when I was doing some research, I wasn't satisfied with my answer. So the priest I think I was talking to, he said that there were more than 10 commandments. And if I read all the commandments, it will end up being about 13 to 15 of them. But when I look at Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 13, God specifically says He gave us, or He gave Israel, His 10 commandments. Mm-hmm. So my question is, why is it, if God gave 10 commandments, why is it that you got rid of one and split up the 10th commandment, which talks about coveting, and make it one for thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, and make it one for thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife?
Okay. Let me ask you a question. You said that you got rid of one. Who do you mean you, and what commandment did they get rid of?
Well, so the second commandment, which talks about thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images or worship them or bow down to them, right? And I understand that the answer the guy gave me the last time, he said that the priest will order to make those angels for the Ark of the Covenant. All right.
Okay. So who got rid of this commandment?
Well, according to what I read your catechism, you have.
Let me just clarify something. When you say you mean Catholics?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I say you.
And when you say our catechism, do you mean the Catechism of the Catholic Church?
Correct.
Okay. Well, actually, the Catechism of the Catholic Church has a very helpful section on this. It doesn't include all of the information I'm about to give you, but it does note that there is more than one way of numbering the Ten Commandments. It mentions two in particular. It mentions one that was proposed by St. Augustine and that has become common in Catholic and Lutheran circles, and it also mentions another that is common in Orthodox and Calvinist circles. So there's more than one way. Now, actually, the Catechism doesn't go into this, but there's a third way. And the third way is used commonly in Jewish circles. The reason for these different numberings, you're quite correct, there are 10 commandments. What you heard, or at least, I didn't hear the previous conversation you're referring to, so I don't know about the details of it, but what you were told that if you actually look in the text and count the number of imperative statements, that is, statements which instruct or command you to do something, there is more than 10. There's like 14. And what that means is since we're told there are 10 commandments, you have to make choices about how are you going to group these 14 or so statements so that the number comes out to be 10. Well, some of them are on similar topics, like for example, I am the Lord your God. Now, that's actually not a commandment the way it's phrased, but it's part of this text, and it is, in fact, reckoned by the Jewish reckoning as the first of the commandments, because the word commandment is a little misleading. In Hebrew, we're told there are 10 words that God has given here. And obviously, there's way more than 10 literal words. What he means is there's 10 topics that we're given instructions about. And one of those instructions is, I am the Lord your God. Well, that's similar to, you shall have no other gods before me. And that's similar to, you shan't make any idols. On the other hand, so that's kind of at the beginning of the block of text. We have some statements that are on related subject matter. They all deal with monotheism. At the end, we also have some statements on related topics, saying you shan't covet your neighbor's wife, you shan't desire your neighbor's property. Well, those also are kind of on similar topics. And so that's where the three different systems make different choices. Some of them will group matter from the front of the block of text into a smaller number of commandments to make the total come out to be 10. Some will group matter at the end of the block of text together to make the total number of commandments come out to 10. But these are interpretive choices that have to be made by us today, because the text, unfortunately, doesn't number the 10 commandments for us. If it did, these systems would never have come up. It tells us the total number of the commandments, but it doesn't say, oh, and here's where commandment number 1 begins and here's where it ends. If it did that, there wouldn't be any dispute on any of this. So the Catechism's attitude is simply that it says this catechism is going to use the one that's become traditional in Catholic circles. It doesn't say it's the only one that's possible. Doesn't say it's the definitively correct one. It just says this is the one that's most commonly used in our circles, and so we're going to use it here. It does not remove any commandments.
If you look in a Catholic Bible, whether you're looking in Deuteronomy 5 or Exodus 20, all of the statements, beginning with I am the Lord your God and continuing down to the coveting and desiring ones, all of them are there. That material is all present in the Catholic Bible. When the Ten Commandments are read in the liturgy, it's all read. The question then is not, have we removed a commandment? The answer is no. The question is just, why have they been grouped in this way? And the grouping is based on the similarities of the material, and it's not something the Church considers there to be one definitively correct answer to. Personally, I tend to think that if you ask what was in the mind of the biblical author, I tend to think the Jewish numbering is likely has the best chance of being what he was thinking. And in that one, the commandment against having other gods and the commandment against having idols is grouped together, like in the Catholic interpretation, and the commandment, Catholic and Lutheran interpretation, I should say, and the commandments against desiring your neighbor's wife or property are also grouped together as the 10th commandment, like in the Orthodox and Calvinist numbering system. And the extra commandment that you need is right there at the top. I am the Lord your God, which is clearly the most important thing of all right here. And that's the first commandment in the Jewish numbering system.
Julian, thanks so much. Appreciate that question. 888-31-TRUTH, the number. I've got a whole hour coming up after this of more questions, but we'll go now to Aaron in Iowa, listening on the Catholic Answers app. Thanks for downloading the app onto your phone, Aaron. Your question for Jimmy.
Hi, guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Jimmy. My question is about the Passion narrative in the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 14, verse 50. It says, "And they all left him and fled." And then 51 says, "Now a young man followed him wearing nothing but a linen cloth about his body. They seized him, but he left the cloth behind and ran off naked." And my question is, just to me, that particular detail doesn't seem to fit anywhere in the story, and I was wondering if you knew if there's any significance about that particular detail, about that that person that's mentioned. And
it's a very interesting question. There are two theories that you commonly hear. There's one that you commonly hear these days, and this actually was only proposed fairly recently, within the last 100 or so years. The idea here is that the young man who runs away naked is Mark himself, and that the reason he mentions it is because he's writing the gospel, and even though it's a very minor incident, he's putting it in as kind of his own cameo in the gospel to say, hey, I was here. Kind of like you'll sometimes find painters in, say, the Renaissance painting themselves into their own paintings. Or if you watch an Alfred Hitchcock movie, let's say North by Northwest, Alfred Hitchcock will have a little cameo where he inserts himself into the movie, and in North by Northwest he runs up to a bus and the door shuts in his face and the bus drives off. And so if you know about these little cameos, you can watch for them. And the proposal is that that's what's happening here with Mark. There are some problems with that. Number one, it's not clear that this kind of cameo thing existed in first century literature. I can't think of any other examples of it. Also, why wouldn't he have named himself and said, and then Mark? Because he names other people. You know, he names Peter, he names the other 12, the others of the 12. Why wouldn't he just mention his own name? Why would he keep it secret? And then, when we meet Mark for reals in Acts chapter 12, he's also described as a young man, but Acts chapter 12 occurs 10 years later, and he wouldn't be a young man if he had been a young man in AD 33. He wouldn't still be a young man in AD 42 or 43. He would be a normal adult man at that point. And so that casts doubt, since he is described as a young man in Acts 12, that suggests he would have been too young to be the Mark in the Passion narrative, to be the unnamed figure in the Passion narrative. Also, we have church fathers who expressly say Mark never met Jesus. And so that would preclude this also. Mark wasn't a witness of the ministry of Christ. So that leaves us with, well, why would we have this mysterious unnamed figure who seems to be significant enough to be mentioned, but he's not named for some reason? And here, there's a very interesting proposal by a couple of scholars named Samuel Burskog and Richard Bauckham. They have observed that there are certain characters in the Synoptic Gospels whose names are omitted, like the person who cuts off the high priest servant's ear, or the woman who anoints Jesus with oil, and they then get, their identities are revealed in the Gospel of John, but they're not initially. Why not? Well, if you look at them, both of those acts could be construed of as having revolutionary significance. Attacking the guy arresting Jesus, anointing him when Messiah means anointed one, those could be viewed as revolutionary acts. And so the proposal is, at this time, at the time the Synoptic Gospels were written, like Mark, these people were potentially in danger, and so they were given protective anonymity. But by the time John was written, they didn't need that. So who else might need protective anonymity? Because they try to arrest this guy who runs away naked. Well, John 11 tells us they were also trying to kill Lazarus. Maybe Lazarus is the other person who needed protective anonymity when the Synoptic Gospels were being written.
Aaron, thank you very, very much. Thanks to everybody who has called. If you remain on the line, we'll do our very best to get to you next hour, so don't go anywhere. If you haven't called yet, 888-318-7